What if the person you've been mocking your entire life turned out to be the one you should have been afraid of? Bradley Whitemore strolled into the upscale restaurant like he owned the place. The rich businessman, always in a custom-tailored suit, was the type of person who walked around with a smug grin, convinced that the world revolved around him. Today, he was seated at a corner table, the one that had the best view of the restaurant's bustling kitchen. He never hesitated to let everyone around him know that he was someone who didn't settle for anything less than the best. Tasha Johnson, a black woman in her mid-30s, worked behind the kitchen counter. She moved gracefully, her hands quickly chopping vegetables, stirring sauces, and checking the temperature of the oven. Every dish she created was infused with a passion and precision that made it clear this was no ordinary cook. Yet to Bradley, she was just another worker in a restaurant he considered beneath him. He had no idea who she really was. Bradley's eyes locked on Tasha as she plated a dish. With an almost mocking tone, he leaned over to his waiter, a young man who nervously served him, and muttered loud enough for everyone around to hear. "Can you tell me who cooked this? It looks simple. There's nothing impressive about it. This place seems more like a diner than a fine restaurant." The waiter, visibly uncomfortable, hesitated for a moment before responding. That would be Chef Tasha. She's the head chef here." Bradley raised an eyebrow. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The head chef of this place? He was sure he could do better. The thought of a black woman running a kitchen, especially one at a restaurant like this, didn't sit well with him. "Head chef?" Bradley scoffed. "More like she's just here for the paycheck." Tasha, overhearing the conversation, didn't flinch. She continued working, her focus unbroken. She dealt with this kind of ignorance before, people assuming that just because of her race and her background, she didn't belong in such prestigious kitchens. But Tasha wasn't the kind of person who needed validation from someone like Bradley Whitemore. As Bradley continued to make remarks under his breath, he looked around, assessing the room with his critical eyes. Everything had to meet his high standards. He pointed to his plate with disdain when his dish arrived. "This doesn't even look like what I ordered." "What is this? A joke?" He glanced again at Tasha, who had just placed another dish on the counter. She smiled politely at the kitchen staff, not giving away any sign of frustration. Bradley's attitude was typical, but that didn't mean it was any easier to ignore. Every insult he threw her way chipped away at the confidence of others around her, especially the younger chefs who watched with concern. What Bradley didn't know was that Tasha wasn't just anyone. She had built her career from the ground up, working in the most prestigious kitchens in the world. But none of that mattered to him. In his mind, she was just another cook in a restaurant he'd never even heard of. And to him, that made her inferior. As he sat there, waiting for the next round of insults to come out of his mouth, he was completely unaware that the woman he was mocking was not just a chef. She was a world-class culinary genius who had earned a Michelin star at one of the finest restaurants in the world. To Bradley, she was just a black woman working in a place he deemed unworthy of his time. Tasha continued to work quietly, her hands moving with precision as she prepared the next set of dishes. The kitchen was a well-oiled machine, each chef moving with practiced skill. But her mind wasn't entirely on the food. She knew Bradley was still watching, his eyes occasionally darting over to her in judgment. His sneers and snide remarks didn't bother her as much as they used to, but they were still hard to ignore. Tasha had been in this industry for over 15 years, and in those years, she'd learned how to navigate the difficult, sometimes hostile, world of high-end kitchens. She'd worked under Michelin star chefs, been a part of some of the best culinary teams in the world, and earned her own star. But in spaces like this, there were always those who underestimated her, who assumed she was just another face in the crowd. Despite the comments, she remained focused. Tasha knew what she was capable of, and nothing could shake her confidence now. She wasn't going to let Bradley or anyone else define her worth. She just needed to keep doing what she did best, cooking. Bradley, however, continued to look for flaws. He didn't understand the intricacies of the dishes that Tasha was creating, nor did he care to. To him, food was just something to be consumed. He wanted his meals fast, without thought, and without the creativity that went into them. When the waiter came to check on him, Bradley gave his usual critique. "I don't get it," he said, leaning back in his chair. "How can this woman, no, this chef, be so highly praised? I've eaten better meals at my favorite steakhouse. She's not what I expected at all." The waiter shifted uncomfortably. "She's actually a Michelin-starred chef, sir. She was head chef at—" "I don't care about that," Bradley interrupted, his voice growing louder. "I want something real. Not this fancy nonsense." Tasha could hear everything. She knew he was talking about her, and she could hear the tone of his voice, dripping with condescension. The old Tasha might have felt anger rise within her, but now she just smiled to herself. Bradley had no idea what he was dealing with. As the night went on, Tasha's team continued to work in harmony. She watched as the younger chefs prepared dishes, each one reflecting a different aspect of her training. She taught them everything she knew, pushing them to always strive for excellence. Tasha's reputation in the culinary world was built on her drive to perfect her craft, not just her skills in the kitchen. She had learned the importance of patience, humility, and hard work in every dish she made. Bradley's impatience continued to grow. He saw the other tables around him, their meals coming out on time, perfectly plated and beautifully presented. But his meal was taking longer than he expected. He wasn't used to waiting for anything, especially not food. The minutes ticked by as Tasha worked, her eyes scanning the kitchen, ensuring everything was going smoothly. He looked around the room and scoffed. "I guess this is what happens when you hire unqualified people to run your kitchen. No wonder this place is so overrated." Tasha paused for a second, taking in a deep breath. She kept her gaze steady and kept cooking. Bradley's words didn't hurt her, not anymore. But they reminded her of how people like him viewed her, based purely on surface-level assumptions and stereotypes. The longer Bradley waited, the more his frustration grew. He didn't know it yet, but his impatience would soon lead him to a lesson he would never forget. Finally, the moment arrived. Tasha placed the last dish on the counter, the golden brown sear on the meat just perfect, the sauce glistening under the soft lights of the kitchen. She turned to one of her assistants, nodding for him to take it out to Bradley's table. It was a dish she had carefully crafted, a modern take on a traditional recipe she had mastered years ago. Each ingredient was carefully chosen for its balance of flavor, texture, and visual appeal. As the waiter approached Bradley's table with the dish, Tasha stepped out of the kitchen, taking a deep breath as she made her way to the front of the restaurant. She knew it was time to put an end to the tension. This was her moment, the moment when the truth would come out. Bradley didn't notice her right away. He was still muttering about his previous meal, trying to make the best of his uncomfortable situation. When the waiter placed the new dish in front of him, Bradley immediately began to pick it apart with his eyes. He wasn't interested in the presentation or the effort that went into it. He was only concerned with proving how much better he could do. "What is this supposed to be?" he said with a sneer. "Some sort of last-ditch effort?" Tasha stood there, watching him. His arrogance was almost comical at this point, and she couldn't help but smile slightly to herself. She'd been waiting for this moment for a long time, knowing the time would come when she would have the chance to show him just who she was. Bradley took a bite. His face didn't change at first. He chewed slowly, his eyes narrowing as he processed the flavors. He was used to dishes that were rich, heavy, and predictable. But this was something different. Something unexpected. The flavor was bold but balanced, with just the right amount of spice. The texture of the meat was perfectly tender, the sauce smooth and rich without being overpowering. Tasha watched his reaction carefully. The smug expression that had been plastered on his face all night slowly began to fade. He took another bite, this time savoring it, before setting his fork down on the plate. He looked up at her, and for the first time that night, his expression was completely different. "Wait a minute," Bradley started, his voice trailing off as realization began to set in. He looked at Tasha, his eyes narrowing as he tried to piece things together. You're the head chef here?" Tasha nodded, her expression calm but confident. "I'm the one who crafted that dish," she said softly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside her. "I've spent my life perfecting my skills, earning my place among the best in the world. And yes, I've earned a Michelin star." Bradley's face flushed with embarrassment as the full weight of his ignorance sank in. The man who had spent the entire evening mocking her was now staring at the woman he had underestimated all along. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Tasha, still standing tall, let the silence hang for a moment, letting him stew in his own discomfort. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even surprised. But she knew this was the moment when everything would change for him. "I don't need your validation," Tasha continued, her tone firm but measured. "I never did. But now you know who I am, and I think you'll think twice before judging someone based on their appearance or background again." Bradley sat there, stunned. He had no comeback, no excuse. The arrogance that had defined him all night crumbled in an instant. Don't let others define your worth. Hit that subscribe button to see more stories like this.